My name's Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas. This week, a conversation about bridging the gap between prehistory and history with Daniel Lord Smail, professor of history at Harvard University and author of On Deep History and the Brain.
There's an extraordinary range of things that we're doing that we know have neurophysiological effects. In other words, that they alter the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain and the hormones in the body. Reading is known to have this, for example. Gossip, back massages, grooming, obviously sex. There's a lot of things that we consume, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, all those things have measurable neurophysiological effects on the body and brain. Neuroscience is exploring these fields more and more and actually trying to find out what kinds of neurotransmitters or hormones are associated with what kinds of practice. Once we take that, we start to push back into the past. Something as basic as the rise of the modern global order. The history of capitalism is just going to look different once we start to use neuroscience. Not necessarily going to change the story. I think it's just going to add richness to the way in which the story is told.
Listen to any Marketplace of Ideas interview anytime on our online archive on the website colinmarshallradio.com or download them from iTunes. Open up iTunes and search for the Marketplace of Ideas. And there you can also subscribe and get it every single week automatically. If you listen to the show, why not add yourself to our international listening community on our Frapper map, available on our website, colinmarshallradio.com. My guest is Daniel Lord Smail, professor of history at Harvard University and author of a new book entitled On Deep History and the Brain. Daniel, welcome to the Marketplace of Ideas.
Thanks, Colin.
Now, you build your book on a bit of an intellectual struggle within the discipline of history, and that is something that a lot of non-historians might not think about, but they probably should. That is, when does the work of a historian begin, and what's the nature of that debate?
I think it's manifold, and it centers partly on the question of a date. When do we say that the work of the historian can begin? And partly on the evidence that historians can use to look at the past, because traditionally, certainly for the last 100 years or so, there's been a strong emphasis on the idea that historians use documents and can really only use documents. And if you take that point of view, then it limits your history to the period since the invention of writing.
And then what brought you into this debate with the position that you take?
Well, ultimately, it really boils down to the fact that I was teaching a course in which I was just asking the sort of hypothetical question, well, what would history look like if we started a lot earlier? And that made me ask a lot of questions, which a lot of other historians ask as well, which is, well, do we really depend upon documents? Do we have to use documents? And if we don't, then how can we write a history using non-documentary evidence? And there's more and more of that available. It's been really increasing in the last decade or two. The realm of evidence is growing by leaps and bounds.
What are the points at which history has started? I mean, there's been, in your book you mentioned a couple of dominant times that have been used as the beginning of history. What are we up to now?
In Europe and the Americas, in other words, in the areas that have been strongly influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's been a long sense, in fact, for several thousand years, people just knew that history began with the creation of the world about 6,000 years ago. And the real issue is in the 19th century, when the fields of archaeology and paleoanthropology began to develop, the sense of time really grew enormously. So part of the question is, well, what did historians do with their own sense of history when they realized the enormous depths of time that were sort of opening up beneath their feet, in a sense? What's really interesting is if you go back and look, and this is one of the things I was doing early on in the book, if you go back and look at what historians were doing, you find that they're kind of looking at that abyss of time and saying, that really bothers me. we have to find some excuse for claiming that that's not history. And they come up with a number of reasons for justifying why a history can only be a short history, why it has to stay within the short chronology, which of course just sort of happens to be the same chronology of Judeo-Christian time, namely right around 5,000-6,000 years ago. So the biblical time sort of gets translated into the invention of civilization and writing, but it amounts to the same thing in a way.
And you're advocating a deep history rather than a shallow history, and that is treating history as something with essentially no beginning?
Yeah, ultimately something with no beginning, and that's a little bit problematic because ultimately it takes us back to the Big Bang, and people begin to say, well, is that history at all? What I really boil down to is that history, the kind of things that I think we ought to at least be aware of in a department of history or in a curriculum that teaches history, that kind of history ought to at least be a human history. So we could begin in some sense with the origin of the genus. And what that means, it's really nothing more complicated than saying that historians have to be partly responsible for understanding what archaeologists and molecular anthropologists and paleoanthropologists are doing in their own reconstructions of the early history of humans.
What other realms, what other sciences, what other disciplines have you had to draw from to create a deep history?
Well, there's a lot of historical sciences out there that deal with humanity, and these, I think if you talk to practitioners in the field, I think they would all say, yeah, actually, we've been doing a history for a long time, and it's funny that it took you guys so long to catch up with us. The ones I mentioned are some of the most significant, namely archaeology, paleoanthropology, or biological anthropology. The newest field, which is in the sense been the most exciting lately, is molecular anthropology, the study of population genetics, which is using evidence from various forms of DNA in modern populations. There's a little more recently in time, as it were, the field of linguistics, historical linguistics. They can also make some kinds of assumptions. That gets a little complicated. And then finally, and this is some of the material I used in developing one argument in the book, there's fields generally known as evolutionary psychology or behaviorism, which looks at human behavior and says, well, can't we plot this in a historical framework as well? And what's the history going to look like if you start to think about the brain and its history?
How receptive is the discipline of history to this mixing from other areas of thought, areas of knowledge?
That really depends on who you talk to. I think most historians are really interested in new ideas and like to talk about them. I think a lot of historians would understand sort of intuitively that the past, the deep human past, really is part of our history. And one of the things that people will say to me often is, well, that's fine. I just don't know what to do with it. How can I fit it into my research or my lectures? And that's a very serious issue. It's not easy to figure out how to tell the story. In other words, if you think of a really great undergraduate lecture course, the instructor was telling you a really good story, and that's not necessarily easy to do yet. So I think one of the issues that's facing people like me who are interested in developing a deep or a big history is trying to find a way to tell the story in a really compelling way that's going to make students sit up and listen and make colleagues say, yeah, this is relevant.
What are the challenges of that, of telling a deep history compellingly?
Well, I'll tell you, the big one, Colin, is that if you think about a lot of history courses, they're ultimately based around, well, how did we get the United States of America? Or how do we get democracy? And those kinds of questions, we can't really do a lot with deep history in that. In other words, I'm not going to say to anyone that they're going to learn a lot more about the emergence of the U.S. Constitution by taking a really deep historical perspective. So it partly is partly a question of saying, well, what is history about? If it's about nations, that's one thing. But if it's about, say, the environment or material culture or relations between the sexes, between women and men, those kinds of issues, those are things where it's more likely that we're going to be able to put together one of this sort of narrative I was telling you that can link the deep past with the more recent past in a really interesting way.
Was the deep history subject matter something that you were teaching in a single course? It was a course about deep history, or did that? Oh, okay. So how did that develop? Did you just jump right into it and do a deep history course, or was that a course that kind of became that way?
I did in a way. My father was a historian, and he taught a course which he called the Natural History of Man 30 years ago. And when I began teaching history, I often thought, well, would it be fun to try to reconstruct this course? But this is around the same time that and I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be aware that Jared Diamond's book came out in the late 90s, and a number of other works of really mind-bending kinds of general stories about humanity's deep past came out. And I was just reading these as, just for fun along they provided a great basis that sort of inspired me. Well, why don't we use some of these as textbooks in a class? And what would students think if I taught a course called a Natural History of Humankind? So I first taught that course in 2000, and it turned out to be great fun.
Tell me about the student response to the course. Were they more engaged than the average history course, or differently?
That first class was really exciting, and for me at least, it was really exciting because I was feeling my way around a new subject as opposed to teaching from the yellow notes, lecture notes, that we're sometimes accused of teaching. So I was having a great fun, and students usually pick up on that when the teacher's having fun. The reactions were really interesting. I had a lot of students who both liked the course but kept saying, "So, tell me, why is it history?" Or why do we have to learn so much science? And I had one of the most interesting experience I had a student who told me at one point that he grew up in a household with creationist beliefs, and he didn't believe any of this stuff about the past more than 6,000 years ago. But he was just intellectually curious about the course. So actually, we all had a great deal of fun, and there was one student evaluation I got at the end of the course that really suggested that I was onto something. The student wrote, "This is the first history course that has ever made sense to me."
So what do you think that the addition of scientific material brings to these students who say that it's the first one that makes sense? What were they looking for that they couldn't find in other history courses?
I'm not sure I can answer that particular question. For some of them, I suspect that part of it was that they had, in their undergraduate studies, science was something that you did over there, and humanities or social sciences you sort of did here. And the two didn't mix a whole lot. So you might use fields, you might use fields like statistics in two different kinds, like in economics as well as in biology or something like that. But in other respects, they weren't necessarily seeing a lot of connections in the curriculum. And so for some of them, I think it was really interesting to see that you could make connections between fields in the curriculum, the core requirements that they have to do for an undergraduate major, that they perhaps they hadn't seen before.
Now we're getting into kind of the C.P. Snow two cultures territory. What potential do you think it holds, the merging of certain elements of humanities and the sciences, not just for history, but in general? Is there a lot to be done with that?
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount to be done with it, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who is really distressed about the fact that we've fallen into this two magisterium modes, as it were, as far as academia is concerned. I like to say at times that there's a lot of fields, as you know, that talk of themselves as being interdisciplinary, and I like to think that the great frontier of interdisciplinarity is bringing scientific disciplines back together with human sciences in a very serious way. And I think that the study of the deep past is one obvious way to do that, because it's a way to link history and also fields like sociology and cultural anthropology with fields like physical anthropology and archaeology. So I guess that's one of the points that I would make. The second observation is that when I read works in, say, neurophysiology, in particular studies of the brain and other products of some of the modern sciences, I sometimes find myself getting really frustrated that the authors haven't realized the historical implications of the claims they're making. I sort of want to shake them and say, it's time that you begin to think with history again. So I'd like to think that it's not a question just of the human sciences borrowing from the physical sciences. I like to think that a lot of physical sciences would do a lot better if they learned how to think historically as well. How would
the, say, physical sciences be different if they did think more historically? How would the material, how would their knowledge be presented differently?
Let me just give you one small example that I was puzzling over once, and I actually find it quite inspirational. But I was reading a work on stress and the way in which stress operates in the human body through the production of stress hormones, and it's really extraordinary, very interesting book. At one point, the author makes a comment about how poverty is associated with stress, and also associates, in a very general way, poverty with the agricultural revolution. So going back 6,000-8,000 years, the agricultural revolution creates a human society in which you have the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are the poor. They become subject to much, much greater stress in their own lives. And so his conclusion there is, well, the agricultural revolution was one of the great stupid moves of all time because it created poverty and it created stress. So you can see the point, and on some level I think it's entirely right. But because the author wasn't used to thinking with history, see how the invention of poverty is in fact an enormously potent political device for political elites. Because if you can create a system whereby people who are poor are constantly subjected to stress hormones and therefore have motivation reduced and aren't going to compete with you, and you can see how power can develop much more forcefully. So what I would like to do is take that argument that he was proposing, which I think was fascinating, and just sort of tweak it and say, well, let's actually work with this in a historical way. Can we talk about how agricultural and civilization created a whole new world of stress and stress hormones among certain kinds of sectors in society, and what's that going to mean for the development of power?
You can tell this is really fertile ground for an inquiry. It's sort of the, I don't want to use such a cliche as the tip of the iceberg, but there's a lot to be learned there.
Absolutely, yeah. The tip of the iceberg, it's what I'm doing right now, and there's other people working on this as well, is I think we're just scratching on the surface of the things that we can do. And the real question is getting enough ideas out there so that we can all start to think of it and think with it and try to figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Scratching the surface, that's a much better cliche. That's what I was looking for. But the breaking free from the tyranny of the written document is one of the advantages of a deep history. And what documents does deep history use? And I put quotes around documents when I say that in regard to deep history.
Sure. But actually, you can probably take the quotes off that, and I'll explain why. Because one of the funny things, which I didn't realize this, a colleague told me this as I was chatting with him, the word document, actually, in its original etymology, means that which teaches. So it only got limited to a written document only by the late 18th century, and in particular by the 19th century. Before that, a document meant anything that could teach, written or otherwise. So in fact, the etymology of document is part of this trend that I was describing earlier of the growing reliance on written sources in history. The documents, I think some of the most exciting documents, as it were. Well, let me just start with DNA. The population geneticists who are looking at DNA, both ancient and modern DNA, I could go into some detail about how this works. It gets a little complicated. But they treat the DNA almost as if it's a text. They look at strings of nucleotides, the 4 nucleotides, and they say, well, it composes letters, and these letters make up words, and these words make up paragraphs and documents. And what we're looking at when we take a sampling of a modern population through a cheek swab or something like that, what we're looking at, in fact, is something like an addition of a text. And it's a text that was written a long time ago, and we're looking at a modern edition. And maybe some errors have crept into the edition, and we can compare this edition with that one and show that this one has this life history and that one has a different history. But they're treating DNA exactly as if it were a text. So the only difference, and to a lot of people this is a big difference, but the only difference is that humans write written documents, but we don't write DNA. So there's no agent there in the case of DNA. But in all other respects, it's exactly like a document, and we could use it as the word document. And then much the same goes for the speechless things that archaeologists dig up, potsherds, also bones. These are also, if you talk to any archaeologist, they would say, yeah, this is very much like a text. I read it as if it were a document. And
is the lack of an intention behind a person's DNA, is that helpful to a historian, or is it less data? I was not quite clear on that.
Yeah, no, that's a really tough question. And you were asking earlier about what the reaction of historians has been, and there's some people, and I think this is just I respect the point of view. It's just something we have to talk through. There's some people who are going to say it makes a difference whether it was intended or not, because if it's intended, I can write something about what people were aiming to achieve as opposed to the things that were just happening to people. There's a real sense in which historians like to deal with people. They like to know the names of people, that there's someone back there that they can emote with. And that's just partly the way in which our discipline works, the way in which the field of history works, and the way in which I think a lot of people would think about the ways in which they think about history, about biography or great presidents, things like that. So I think we candidly have to admit that we're never going to have that kind of thing. We're never going to know real people. We're never going to know their names, who children were as we go far back in the past. It gets foggier and foggier, obviously, the further back we go. So in this sense, it's probably better to say that a history like this is more like an environmental history. It's more about a macro history or a history of abstract, more general sets of forces that are shaping human society. And I think that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. For one thing, I find environmental history very exciting and refreshing. So I think, Colin, that's probably a question of taste. And as long as we can acknowledge that it's just a taste, what we happen to like in history, then it opens the doors for saying that, well, at least some of us can do this kind of history.
Is that a significant obstacle to deep history, though, the lack of people to identify with, or is it not that much of a minority taste without the people?
I think the real issue here is that there are fields, I was mentioning in environmental history, there are fields like that are becoming more and more common, more and more practiced. You find more and more historians doing it in history departments. So, and they're training students. So I think while it's still a minority opinion, as it were, certainly not the mainstream of history, I think it is becoming more and more common. I don't think that kind of field or that kind of area would have any problem with pushing the sense of what history has to be responsible for further back. I guess the other point is that if you talk to archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, even if they don't know the people whose artifacts are digging up, I think a lot of them have quite a profound emotional contact with them. And it's in part because of the artifacts that they discover and sometimes the circumstances in which they discover them. You can read out, or at least suppose, some of the extraordinary events that brought about the deposition of that particular artifact.
Going back to the very title of your book, On Deep History and the Brain, I wanted to ask, what does the brain have for historians to look at?
The book, in a sense, is part of the purpose is, first of all, to open up the idea that, we can think with humanity's deep past, and we can try to find ways to turn it into history and build it into the way in which we teach and write about history. The brain is, in a sense, one of the proposals, one of the things I think we could think of for developing a long history. I mentioned earlier the problem of trying to find a way to link the deep past to the recent past, to tell a story that binds the two. And I think there's lots of ways of telling that story, and I think the brain is just one of them in a sense. So one of the things that I think that makes the brain interesting is that we now know a great deal about how it works. We can't see it in operation in the past. We can't actually take a dead person and put that person in an MRI machine and see how the neurons are functioning. But we can think more in a more abstract or general way about knowing how the brain works. I think it's very likely that we can start to write histories that use that as a model for interpreting some of our evidence. The other point about the brain is that it's clear. It's clear to me and to a lot of people that the new field of neuroscience is going to have a great deal of impact, or is going to have at least some impact on the way in which we write modern histories of the last few centuries, or histories of the medieval period or the ancient period. And I think that as we begin to write those histories, we're going to realize that because the brain itself is old, it's been around for a long time in its current form, that we simply have to know more about the deep past to understand what we're seeing about the way in which the brain is operating in modern society.
Now, I'd like to hear from you how, say, the history books one reads in school might be different as a result of advances in neuroscience were they to be completely incorporated. What would the student be reading differently, say, in college after a deep history with a perspective on the brain is incorporated?
We're still scratching at the surface here. So what I have are hypotheses or things that I can throw out and that we can think with. Lately, I've been really interested in the range of things that we see around us in the 20th century, 21st century, that are known to have some kind of effect on the neurochemistry of the brain. So if you had the experience of going to, say, an IMAX movie and you find yourself getting dizzy as you're watching, say, a plane zoom over a landscape and move right and left. Have you ever had that experience?
Sort of. It's been a while since I've seen an IMAX, though.
Yeah. Well, I was really struck once in having exactly that experience. And you can have the same kind of experience in a horror film where you can find yourself really shocked and jolted by the adrenaline that you're getting. Once you start to look around, you realize that there's an extraordinary range of things that we're doing that we know have neurophysiological neurophysiological effects. In other words, that they alter our body chemistry in some way. They alter the neurotransmitters, the levels of neurotransmitters in the brain and the hormones in the body. So these would be, reading is known to have this, for example. So is gossip, for that matter. Gossip, back massages, grooming, obviously sex. There's a lot of things that we consume, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, all those things have measurable neurophysiological effects on the body and brain. You can tell that they do in part because some of these practices are mildly addictive. So there are people addicted to internet pornography, for example, or addicted to, in a mild way, to celebrity gossip. So we're learning more and more about this. In other words, neuroscience is exploring these fields more and more and actually trying to find out what kinds of neurotransmitters or hormones are associated with what kinds of practices. Now, from a historical point of view, the point that emerges is that all of the things that we see around us in the 21st century are all historical creations. They've all emerged recently in the last 100 years, at least a lot of the ones that we use now. I mean, think about Facebook addiction. It's only been around for 5 or 10 years or so. When you look at these things, you begin to say, well, here's a history of consumerism or capitalism that is going to make a lot more sense once we realize that these forms are distributed and have an impact partly because, maybe largely because, they're mildly addictive and they have these mild psychoactive properties. Once we take that, we start to push back into the past. Well, do other societies in the past have different kinds of psychoactive or psychotropic mechanisms? Things that they do or things that they eat that alter moods in a way. Once you start to do this, you can begin to say, well, maybe the history of capitalism and consumerism looks a lot different when we start to realize that the things that we consume, the things that we pay money for, in a sense, are things that have these neurophysiological consequences. So to answer your question, it seems to me that something as basic as the rise of the modern global order or the history of capitalism, that's one of the many areas in which it's just going to look different once we start to use neuroscience. It's not necessarily going to change the story. I think it's just going to add richness to the way in which the story is told.
Is that an insight that comes primarily from drawing from the neurosciences, a window into human motivations? Is that the primary? The primary contribution?
I think so. I think that's probably one good way of putting it. Yeah.
It's like we'd be reading history, but it wouldn't just be a list of events. It would be a list of events with what would bring a human to do these things.
One of the really interesting historical examples that I've played with a bit is the late 17th and the 18th century in Europe. You can study this from the perspective of, well, this is the period of the Enlightenment, precursor to the French Revolution. So that's kind of an event style of history. There's also a lot of battles going on, and of course the Sun King and fascinating people. But there's also, if you actually look, sort of deeper into the books that are written about this period, and if you went in and sat in on a lecture course or a public talk about this period, they might also tell you about other things that are going on. It's the period that sees the invention of the novel, the modern romantic novel. It's the period that sees the invention and spread, or perhaps reinvention, of pornography. It's the period that sees the development of coffee in Europe, of coffee houses. Chocolate begins to circulate in Europe quite widely. Once you put all these things together, you realize that Europe in the late 17th and 18th century is beginning to experiment with a whole new array of these mood-altering mechanisms of one kind or another. And the really extraordinary thing is that contemporaries were aware of it. I've been chatting with specialists in the field and collecting some of the observations made by contemporaries. For example, I'll just give you one example. There's a lot of commentary on what novel reading was doing to young girls. Their parents, more or less, are very concerned about what would happen when girls started reading novels. They get swept away in the romance. And there's one particular one that I read that said girls should not be allowed to eat chocolate and read novels at the same time because they just lose all sense of moral sense about their bodies, about their place in the world, things like that. So it's not. We're not actually making this up. It's actually people were aware that there was new things going on in their society. So yeah, you're right. This isn't about kings and battles and about nations, but it is about the sort of history history of, maybe the history of everyday life, if that makes sense, things like that. That's the kind of history it's going to contribute to.
If you're just tuning in, I'm talking to Daniel Lord Smail, professor of history at Harvard University and author of On Deep History and the Brain. And you mentioned novels, and I was thinking back, I've had Lynn Hunt on the show. And we were discussing novels, and she puts a lot of the novels' effect in the introduction of human rights, because of course her book, Inventing Human Rights, she chalks up a third of that to the introduction of the novel and the window into other lives. Is that something that a neuroscience-influenced history could help clarify even further?
Yeah, possibly. And in fact, I have to say I was simply borrowing from Lynn Hunt there when I was talking about the novel, because a lot of what I know, she was the one that originally put me on to that particular question. Lynn is particularly interesting because she also did some studies when she first began working on this. She did some studies in the general field of what I would call neuroscience. I remember she was particularly interested in autism at one point. So to go back to your question, was it influenced by neuroscience? It's part of the problem is that the neuroscientists aren't asking historical questions. I think in this case, when people like Lynn are doing this, they're creating these really inventive ways of looking at something like the 18th century based on, I guess, extrapolating evidence that you can find sort of here and there in the neuroscientific literature. The problem is that because we don't have anyone in that field who is interested in the 18th century, we can't have more controlled experiments based on, say, novel reading in modern populations that we historians could use much more clearly and directly. So when I say hypothetical, we're just scratching at the surface, because I think the kinds of studies we would like to have done are still to come. And I suppose ultimately the way it's going to work, it's going to have to work by virtue of collaboration, by bringing together people who know are expert in different areas and know what kinds of questions you can and cannot ask.
This is as much bringing history to science as science to history, then. Yep. It's an equal, it's not as if the history needs science to be brought to it, but vice versa as well, as we mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I wanted to discuss another thing you mentioned in the book, which was the issue of the metaphors we use to describe history, and you mentioned one that you're not that fond of, which is planting the seed, and out of the seed grows a predetermined civilization. But what metaphors can deep history give us that are better?
Wow. Well, that's a toughie. And I'm not sure I have a good answer for that one. The only answer I've come up with so far is that the metaphor of the seed, just to explain, is the idea that something was invented at some point in time. Say human rights in the 18th century we were just talking about, or things like the modern university was invented in the 12th century. Individualism was invented in such and such a century. When historians write about that, they sometimes use, as you were saying, the metaphor of the seed or other kinds of metaphors of birth or origins or foundations. And the principle supposes that whatever it was that was invented then has a kind of controlling or shaping influence on everything that came after it. So if you think about Magna Carta, 1215, there's this whole fantasy out there that Magna Carta is the origins of the modern constitutional order, and that people think that Magna Carta did have this controlling effect, because once you invent these restrictions on royal power, then they just have this permanent afterlife in a way. What I've tried to point out is that all of these kinds of arguments or metaphors are based on almost on the idea that was a seed or a little packet of DNA that was created at some point. And it is shaping the subsequent history, the way in which DNA will shape the growth of an individual. So sure, there's some environmental circumstances, but basically the form of the individual, of the plant or the person or whatever, is laid down in that initial fragment of DNA, and then it grows. And I just don't think that that's how history actually works. So I haven't been able to think of another appropriate metaphor, but what I am sure is that it's better for history in general to think with what the biologists call phylogeny, namely history not as the growth of the individual, but instead history is the evolution of a species in a genus as one species changes into another, so that there's a light shaping of the past, but that each particular era is its own construct. So if I ever come up with a good metaphor, I'll ring you up and let you know what it is.
Well, that's good. It's a complicated subject.
It's
a new subject, so I don't expect anything particularly cut and dried as far as metaphors goes. But it is interesting to hear about deep history in terms of what you find wrong with the seed metaphor and how it goes to another element of more general biology, not just neuroscience. But so there are elements of biology just as a wider field that you can draw from, not just the biology of the brain, then.
Sure. I think the thing is that biology is a deeply historical discipline. It has many, many powerful models for thinking about change over time. When biology developed these ideas, began to work with them in the late 19th century, in the wake of Darwin, and throughout the 20th century, the historians of the period were really excited about certain biological ideas and metaphors, and started to work with them a lot. This is kind of dry or dull historiography, so I won't say much about it. But if you go back and look at the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the historical literature is littered with biological metaphors of all kinds. All that we got left with is this metaphor of birth or seed, and the other biological metaphors dropped out over the course of the 20th century. So in a sense, I think that this is, as you were saying, we're not thinking necessarily with biology, but just saying, well, does biology have ways of thinking about change over time that historians like me need to think about again and freshen ourselves up? And as I said before, I think that this can cut both ways. I do think that history has things to offer other disciplines as well.
When you say that the biological metaphors in use dropped out, are you saying that inaccurate biological metaphors dropped out, or that these biological metaphors just fell out of fashion regardless?
I think they just fell out of fashion. So when people use biological metaphors like the seed or like birth, or they'll sometimes talk about the youth of Europe. Those are very generic biological metaphors. Those people are not really thinking seriously with them the way that they were 100 years ago, when historians were quite seriously interested in this case, I have to admit, it was the social side of Darwinian thought that they were quite seriously interested in thinking with, the social and racist side of Darwinian thinking. So it's more that they fell out of the habit of looking to other historical fields like biology.
Was that the time that determinism was sort of in vogue in the general consciousness, that all the biological metaphors were being used?
Yeah, I think to some extent I think that's probably true. The most powerful one was the idea of, around 1900 you had all these ideas that human races were all at different levels of sophistication, and that was for historians, that was probably the most significant one. So in the field, when I'm not working on this, I study medieval European history, and in that particular field, there was a lot of excitement about the Normans. They were called the supermen of Europe. The idea was that they had a particular racial vigor. This is all pre-Nazi kind of social Darwinism. And it's in the 1920s 1930s that they finally said, this isn't working, or it comes with a lot of cost and we don't want to use it anymore.
No kidding.
I'm not in any way trying to defend that particular style of doing history. What I think is interesting, though, is that it was based on the idea that we can learn something from the sciences. And if they learn the wrong thing, well, maybe we can learn the right thing.
I wanted to move on to another biological concept, of course, the idea of evolution, probably the most important biological idea. And you describe in the book the interplay of biological and cultural evolution. And how does that work in a deep historical context?
It's another difficult subject. Let me try to tackle it in this particular way. One of the things you see a lot I was mentioning earlier about how you had historians who would say, well, that's not history for this reason or another. One of the things that you see a lot was the argument that human history begins when humans cease to be biological and start to be cultural. And historians would associate that event with the agricultural revolution, or more particularly with the rise of civilization. The idea is that humans as animals don't shape their environment. They just respond to it the way that animals respond to the environment, evolving as the ecosystem changes, but not shaping it. And it's only with the agricultural revolution that humans started to shape the environment trump their biology. So you see what I'm saying is that the idea is that biology explains everything about humans before 6,000 years and back.
It's like a takeover of cultural evolution in that worldview? Okay.
Yeah, and then culture is what takes over starting 6,000 years ago with cities. So it's not only a historical model, namely that humans cease to be animals and become civilized humans. It's also a kind of a scientific one. That's biology. It belongs to those guys, and this is history, and it belongs to us. We do culture. One of the points I was trying to make in discussing this, well, one of the really significant points is the awareness now that human culture has been around for a long, long time. And in fact, as I'm sure you know, there's a lot of studies on things called animal culture now. So the culture is now seen to be a deeply biological phenomenon. So we can't make any distinction between the culture that we practice now and the culture that shaped human history for 2 million years or more. What that means, in a sense, is that we don't want to distinguish. We shouldn't distinguish between biology as purely a genetic thing. History is a purely cultural thing. Biology deals with a great deal of culture, and by the same token, history should deal with biology.
To your mind, the break between biological and cultural evolution, it was one and then it was the other. That rupture it's sort of a false chasm there between the two.
Yeah.
And the same with the idea of what you were saying before, the break between prehistory and history. And is deep history sort of a mode of thought that replaces breaks with a continuum in every instance? Or?
Absolutely. Yeah, as you say, it's the idea of transcending that rupture that's been placed in human historical time and trying to find a way of bringing it back together.
How has your work as a late medievalist, what has that brought to the table in terms of your work on deep history? Well,
it's several things. First of all, that in some of the work that I've done, I've been very interested. Early on, I was interested in the history of emotions, partly because there's a lot of emotions in medieval texts, and so there's a number of historians now who are interested in this subject. It's one of the things that we now do because so many other fields have been so well worked over that we're squeezed into other areas of study in a way. So, like a number of historians, I began looking at some of the literature coming out of the sciences on emotions to try to understand. And I think that was one of my earliest contacts with. I think the more significant thing is that there's a couple of things. First of all, the medievalists are quite used to the claim that everything that took place in Europe before the 18th century was kind of a long prehistory, and that modernity began with the Enlightenment, and it began with the creation of the world order, of imperialism, colonialism, and that everything that happened before that just didn't really matter to modern history. So in a sense, in my own field, we feel a little bit the way that archaeologists and paleoanthropologists feel, that we feel we've been prehistoried by the reigning sort of origins myths that are told by historians. And I've talked about this with a number of medieval historians, and a lot of them see the point and share the sentiment. So that I suppose it gives medievalists a natural sympathy for other people who have been prehistoried, have been put on the other side of the origin of modernity. The other thing, that's a little fun. The other thing which I think is probably more relevant is the fact that during the Middle Ages we don't have as many documents as people have for the modern period. Medievalists have been much more used to using evidence like archaeological evidence, linguistic evidence, things like climatological evidence, field surveys to try to get a sense of how peasant plots were laid out. It's not dominant. It's not the major way in which medieval history gets done. It's just something that's always there, that we're always used to using. And this is becoming more and more common in medieval history to use, in particular, evidence from genomics. So you see what I'm saying? It's in part because we have fewer documents. We're already quite used to dealing with non-written evidence. In the ancient field, this is even more the case, where archaeology and history are even more tightly related in the ancient field. So you see what I'm saying? The further you go back, the more you have historians who are already accustomed to saying, yeah, but it's not just written documents, it's other stuff. So I think it makes sense in a way that those of us who work in these fields should begin to say, well, maybe we should just keep pushing the time of history back even further and if we don't have documents, so what?
So medievalists and those studying periods before are already prepared to use deep history techniques.
That's right.
More so than modern historians. Now, this book on deep history in the brain is a primer to the idea of deep history, but You write in the introduction that there's a lot more. You could have written a large tome, and what would have been in that tome?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things I'm tackling right now. Would be the history itself. The book that just came out on deep history of the brain was meant to be. I mentioned this in the preface at one point. Was meant to be a kind of a 15-page introduction to the book. The book itself, I've planned it as when I first began saying, well, I have all these lecture notes from teaching this class. Why don't I just put it together as a book? It's not that the other paleohistorians, in other words, the archaeologists, the biological anthropologists, they already have their histories. They already have the sort of textbooks that they use in class, that they use to reconstruct the history. But there's nothing out there. There still isn't anything out there, really, with one major exception, that historians use, that historians would feel comfortable with using. So the one exception is David Christian's really important book, Maps of Time. But I wasn't actually aware of David Christian's work when I first began writing. So my idea was, well, why not turn all these lecture notes into a book that, if nothing else, I could give it to other historians so they could use it for teaching their own classes. So this particular book on deep history of the brain was meant to be the 15-page introduction that just kind of grew and grew. And I felt in the end I didn't want to splice them back together again because the result would be much too long and no one would ever read it. So the history itself is really, which I'm just sort of partway through writing, is really my own take on what would a history look like if you began in a serious way about 1.7 million years ago and wrote it not as an anthropological study but as a historical study. How would it feel? What would it talk about? What are the issues? What are the connections to the present that are going to make it vivid? So that's what I've been wrestling with.
And this book on deep history in the brain, do you think that it will be a work to lay the groundwork, so to speak, of the larger deep history that you're currently working on? Is it meant to prepare people for the larger work?
Yeah, it's certainly meant to prepare me. I would hope to prepare other people. I think one of the major points that I try to make in the book, I think there's many ways that we can go about writing a deep history. My own one really focuses a lot on behavior in the brain, but it's not the only way we can do the history. It's not how the few other examples out there. It's not how they do it. I think what we need, just like in any field of history, we need different angles of attack, different types of stories, different ways of putting things together. And it's by having these overlapping models, these overlapping styles of writing history, that will ultimately be able to flesh out a sort of a full and satisfying sense of how this is relevant to the things that historians do.
And that makes me think of an evolutionary model of the discipline. I think of a whole lot of different historians coming at it from a different angle, a different technique, and then the ones that work will stay on to the next, as it were, generation. I don't know if that crossed your mind, but it's what hit me.
Yeah, it hasn't crossed my mind, but it's very apt. Maybe another way to put it, which is a little less forbidding than that, is that we all have our own niches. In the same way that you have particular kinds of birds that eat this kind of seed, and other kinds of birds that eat that kind of seed, and we're all carving out our own particular niches, and there's plenty of niches out there for us to fit in.
I was thinking also of the story in the book of the arrowheads that became sharper and causing more bleeding by a sort of evolutionary method, as you describe in the book, and you have a story there that you put down as what that could explain that. But it made me think of the ways in which evolution can work outside of a biological context, although not fully outside, as you go on to explain.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a somewhat controversial field, and it has been so for some time, but the idea is that it's generally the field of cultural evolutionary studies. There's a number of anthropologists who are nervous about it and don't like it very much. It tends to be practiced a little bit, well, quite often by biologists or certainly by anthropologists who are influenced by biology. And the idea is that, well, it's not people who invent things, create the shape of what is going to come. Instead, as you were saying, what you have is, in any given society, you have a certain amount of inventive things emerging. And it's a cultural selection process, which is analogous to biological selection, that determines which particular ones are going to go on to have a life and which ones aren't. So even though you can say that there is a particular person who wrote down Magna Carta, the things that determine whether those documents have any future impact are not in the document itself. It's in the culture, in the circumstances that determine which sets of ideas continue to have an impact combination of smart people actually realizing what's good. I don't think we can deny that. Yet there's some combination of that with this more unconscious process of cultural selection. And that's what that field that I tried to briefly survey of cultural evolutionary studies has been trying to do.
Now, lastly, we're running out of time, but I want to ask you one more thing. How much does all this deep history business make you a maverick in the history department?
Well, I don't know. No one's come up and said that to me.
I'm just wondering.
I don't actually know the answer to that. I think one of the things I guess I would say, and just speaking about my own department right now, I think I have some colleagues who are, because I've talked about teaching this. I've just arrived here at Harvard. I've talked to colleagues about teaching this natural history course. Most of them are quite excited about it because I think that what they feel is we're not trying to create a litmus test about what's history. We're not trying to. No one really likes to say that this is what history does and this is what it cannot do. Anything that excites students, that excites people, that makes people think is all to the better. So to that extent, I haven't had any sense of feeling like a maverick. It's certainly not going to be the only thing that I do. I'll continue to do the things that I do. For me, it's partly a teaching issue and partly an issue about the shape of the discipline, and perhaps a little less related to my other kinds of research that I do. So to that extent, I like to think that there's a deep interest out there. But again, if I find out otherwise, I'll let you know.
Well, it seems to me that it does tap into something that a lot of students have been seeking for. Once again, the book is On Deep History in the Brain. Daniel Lord Smail, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes, thanks, Colin.
Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. He also goes under the names Ice Ben and DJ Concept. Check out his website, www.benalthouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.